The other day, I got a message on Discord from my friend Kay, all-round good human, who is LPZW Modules from Berlin. He said, "Hey, we want to hire you to show off the 6mod6 in a demo." And I said, I want to do that because I've wanted your 6mod6 for freaking ages. It is a badass 606 drum machine on steroids. But I said there's one condition. Nobody wants to hear a video that's just like a 25-minute drum solo. Other than that one person. We need an angle. And I thought what would be interesting would be, let's try and trigger this 3 different ways and think a bit about the relative merits of those methodologies. It might inspire you to push things around a bit more. Where CV and CC control has been afforded, what could we do with that? And so we're going to use XOX style programming. We're going to use the Trigger Riot. Sounds like a breaking window. We're actually going to use the madness of the computer. So come, friend, and we will hit things. Chapter 1. First, we're going to hear the sweet raw sound of the module itself, and we'll talk about the power of hand-programmed patterns. We'll get a bonus generative sequencer method you can try at home, and then we'll modulate it to keep things interesting. Okay, in example 1, what if we had a sort of traditional XOX style of sequencer married to this thing, but then also used really generative ways of creating the melodies? You'd get the kind of best of both worlds. The reliability of using hand-programmed rhythms, which, if you ask me, I am returning to, because I think an audience just needs an element of predictability, even if you only use partially handmade drums. And what you can hear here is the core sound of the 6mod6. So on the 6mod6 are these orange indicators. These show you where to place it to get the 606 sound, and that's where I've got it at the moment. But we can push it out of 6mod6 or out of traditional 606. For example, I can use white noise as the source for the hats. And I can use like this weird XOR mode for the snare drum. I can increase the bass drum decay a lot. Introduce a click. Now, the generative bit, this little freak voice, is done with the Mutable instrument stages, because on the stages you can, there's a sample and hold mode, which is this orange one. And if I have stage 5 being a fast LFO, being sample and holded by the first stage, and then I constrain that sample and hold with a attenuator, then that's what I've done here. I basically created a little sequencer, and if I adjust the LFO, then this is going to sample it. It's going to get sampled in a different way. And by the way, I'm using the endorphins running order to trigger it. This is one of the places that we can push this thing into. However, using an LFO to control the hi-hat decay, I think is really powerful. Hear that? The decay goes long and short in succession. It's something that I've been doing recently. I think it's one of the most important things to modulate, along with the accent. And we can do that, because if I create another LFO, never tell you what, I love the Mutable instrument stages, RIP, everyone needs a stages. Let's modulate the accent amount, and then let's put some more accents in. Oof. nice. So the amount of accents are slowly oscillating, low frequency oscillating, and the hi-hat lengths are oscillating too. It's a really nice example that modulating these two parameters just gives us a lot more mileage. And if there's a moral, it's to subtly modulate parameters in a sort of cyclic basis or on a per step basis if possible. I'm a big believer in using looped modulation to do this kind of modulation because it's gratifying to listen to. It's really important that it isn't just totally like wiggly random. So here we're using the sequencer, which is this clever little sequencer that is connected round the back to the 6mod 6. So a little plug for the sequencer. If you are looking for a XOX style, it is really good. It's very small, obviously, but works well in this context. We're able to program this thing. We can mute, we can change directions and adjust the last step and stuff. I think best of all is the idea that you don't need to make any patch connections just to fire the voices off. It just is done directly round the back. So it saves you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cables. So I've come over here, I've adjusted the accent pattern, which is, I think, really important to have accents on the 1, the 5, the 9, and the 13, 14, 15, 16, yes, the 13. That creates that kind of just reliable downbeat. You need the emphasis on the 1, 5, 9, and 13 just to create a nice forward motion. Now, the only thing more important than establishing the sort of bass tone is also hearing what it sounds like with drive and distortion, because whilst that might seem heretical in a sense, in a demo of a drum machine thing, am I not supposed to just play it how it is, like the dry, unmolested signal? But nah, you're not. What is really important, like true of 808s, 909s, is you might well spend $3,500 on an 808, but you sure as hell will process it. So let's listen to what it sounds like with a little bit of drive. Yeah. So this is the Music Thing mini drive, very easy DIY project, very affordable. And of course, it becomes really important what levels we have everything at when we're driving it. I'll turn the hats right down, and they won't be so obvious in the mix. Balance it to ear. So we've got this nice kind of driven sound. How hard can we go? Oh, yeah, I really, really like that. Then the other thing we can do is hit sub-tom. What that does is it knocks the low tom down even further to turn it into a kind of second bass drum. Driving harder into the mini drive with that accent amount. We don't obviously have this bass synth in a kind of very bass register, so leaves lots of room for the kick drums to do that. And we might want to tune them. Now let's get Busy Hats. busyhats.com. Here we've got the low tom in subtom mode and the kick drum kind of in working therefore in the similar sorts of registers to like complement one another, create a kind of little like thing going on to which we can add hats. It's nice to have the sort of double kick drum. If I bring the low tom up, it doesn't really have that roll anymore. Drop it down and it does. Because you've got tune control, tune and tune. My goal and the benefit of this hand-programmed sort of thing is that we can create a very deliberate call and response sort of pattern where instead of using random sources to create our rhythms or Euclidean, rhythms and be at the mercy of an algorithm, we are trying to create something that we respond to ourselves. And that takes trial and error. The way I do it is I literally just start programming and I listen to my guts. Do I respond to it on a visceral level? And I adjust until I do. Yeah, the 606 is so very sexy when it is distorted. I may be overcooking the hats a little bit, but you'll have to forgive me. Yes, we've done a little bit of LFO modulation of decay time, and I loved hearing the hi-hats become slow and long, and I love the fact that it happens with a kind of repeatable nature, that it's just a dumb LFO. For me, that just makes it accessible, because I don't think that true randomness is as exciting as something that is repeating. So how next can we freak this thing? Chapter 2. On using generative drum sequencer, the Trigger Riot, to create strange, bizarre patterns we wouldn't make ourselves, but methods to ensure that what we hear is musical and coherent. So, of course, the whole point of this thing being a module is that you can use other weird third-party modules to gate it with. We've got a whole lot of gate inputs on the left, including one for accent. And here we have the Tiptop Audio Trigger Riot. You know this module, don't you? The Trigger Riot is like the oldest slept-on drum sequencer available, and it's absolutely bonkers. But let us do some kind of very esoteric patterns with the 6 mod that are kind of generative in the sense that we set up conditions and then the drums flow forth. And I'll try and explain a Trigger Riot in a nutshell is that it is basically a load of clock dividers in a row. And there is some logic based on the width of the clock divisions that means that these 4 values all add up and creates a kind of logically combined version of all 4 together where they all play off of each other in an interesting way. And I've got all of the outputs of the Trigger Riot hooked up to all of the inputs of the 6 mod 6. And sort of a bit like we were doing with the XOX style sequencing, what I like about using the Trigger Riot is the fact that there is a sort of predictability to the patterns. Once you've got the conditions set, yes, things vary, but it sounds kind of cohesive. It sounds like one sort of blueprint being played out. It doesn't sound like utter chaos from one moment to the other without any sense of coherence. It's that idea of coherence. And what we have here is this thing in matrix mode, which is where all of the rows to the right get added up and all of the rows from the top to the bottom get added up. So there's a kind of extra coherence. I can affect both at the same time. What I enjoy is the fact that I'm hearing something familiar, but played in an unfamiliar way. Oh, yes, mate. There's lots of other settings on the Trigger Riot which can influence the way that patterns propagate. But the most interesting of all is probability. I set loads of clock divisions on these knobs, and they've gone all the way to the right and they've gone all the way to the bottom, and they're having their effect with each other. But if I turn the probability of each step down a little bit, oh my goodness gracious, I will make all of them 90%. And then there is a 90% probability that that division will influence the row or column. I want there to be the feeling that there's a design. It's not totally random. And I can't say necessarily that I've absolutely achieved that, but do you know what I mean? I don't want generative things to sound like just a computer has come up with them. I want to find a really satisfying combination. And I only want it to move a little bit within those parameters, because too much randomness is just not interesting. Now, how can we maximize what we're getting out of this? Well, there's a reason that there's a attenuator in the center of this. I put this here because what I want to do is create some stepped modulation for the hi-hats. And I'm going to do that by multing, that is to say, taking copies of these outputs and then running them through the mixer. And in so doing, what I will do is I'm going to create sort of stepped modulation by taking the gates that are on and off, mixing them together and sending them into the 6mod6 to create stair-stepped modulation. I am not clever enough to tell you which ones are going to be the most musically satisfying to listen to. This is experimental music. All right, sausage. And then let's start tapping these outputs and feeding them into the controls, such as now the hats are on their own little channels and we've got like crazy reverb applied to them. I can drive the kick drum and the snare without overdriving the hats because I'm using the individual outputs. Bonkers. So note that the way that we modulated these is we took lots of square waves and we mixed them together at different levels, and we took the output and we fed that into the tune input. So this is a really interesting way of creating off-kilter pitch sequences by combining square wave LFOs. That's another one. Absolutely. But here, because it's the square waves that are also triggering our drums, there's a cohesion. If I then go and mess with all the dividers, then our pitch sequence changes with them too. That incredibly weird snare is this like M mode, which changes the noise source. Is it to the metal thing? Rather than white noise, which is that. White noise is satisfyingly satisfying, but there is a noise tune here, and we can use that to sort of digitally crustify the white noise. Sounds like a breaking window. So you can see that we've created a set of conditions and we're riding the results. And what I like about this is that we get that kind of freaky or techeriness, But I really like that there's a sense of cohesion, in the sense that we haven't departed completely from repeatability. We've created conditions that weren't something that we would have manually made on an XOX style sequencer, but we haven't made it so probabilistic that it is no longer satisfying. And it sounds like there's a kind of a mind behind it. And that's, I think, mostly attributed to the fact that the dividers are not changing. They always stay the same. So they phase in a way that is kind of about right. There is also a reset thing that I've never fully understood on the Trigger Riot, but that basically resets the running of all of the various dividers to keep it coherent. And the probability isn't like 10%, so that the influences of each of the steps are relatively consistent. But I think a key thing is that we have got a bit of like interesting modulation of the hats, and that the hats modulation is tied to the to the creation of the drums themselves. That creates cohesion. It makes it all feel unified. How strange. But I like it. What's happening in the Trigger Riot is basically a combination of lots of clock dividers and like logic modules. And I think that there's interesting, crazy ways to sequence drums using those things. I know that our friend Gaz Williams has been having a ton of fun basically sending like irregular rhythms into a clock dividing module, and then using all of the various division outputs and feeding those division outputs into the inputs of drum modules. That can work really well as well. So taking something like a rotating clock divider from 4MS or like the Doepfer A-111-6, and then basically instead of sending a regular rhythm into it, send an irregular one. And then from all of the clock divided outputs, you get regularly divided irregular clocks. And basically, you can trigger drum modules and make quite strange things happen. Of course, I return eternally to this question of whether the results are musical. Obviously, within this weird little thing, we've had some slightly kind of odd atonalities, but I hope it gives you ideas. Like, the other one is just sending square wave LFOs. 8 free-running square wave LFOs into this would be pretty strange. But, with the right kind of timing, you could probably make something that sounded coherent. And then what you'd do is you'd record everything, right? And then you'd chop up maybe 2 bars where it actually sounded good. And then from that, you make your Ortechery masterpiece. I enjoy creating a scenario, that this thing could play out within. I also really enjoyed the control of individual outputs, the ability to drive the ever-loving heck out of the bass drum and the snare and the toms, but leaving these metallic hi-hats on their own channels so that they're not being distorted horrendously. It keeps them the right side of metallic and not harsh. And then we're modulating them with this weird way of malting gates, creating our rhythms, and then mixing them together with a mixer, and then taking that one mixed extra stair-stepped thing, and I modulated the tuning of the hi-hats, because you can do that on the 6mod6, creates this unified madness. As you listen to it, you're like, no, there's a mind behind this. There's some coherence. And I think it's that coherence that is the important line to stay on. Otherwise, it's just noise. For me, I just listen to my heart. It sounds a bit cheesy, but what I mean is like, do I feel anything, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. And if I feel something, then great. And if I don't, then I just keep messing around until I find a position where I'm like, oh, wow, okay, now I'm feeling it. It's like, does it move you in some way? Keep tweaking until it does. If it moves you, it's good. So the 6mod6 actually has quite a surprisingly advanced MIDI capability. More than you would think. And so it's this we turn to next. Let's see what we can do if we midify it. Can we go even more bonkers? Chapter 3. Using MIDI to both make handmade patterns, decoupled modulation, and then pushing around a drum module in insane ways that are extremely cheap to do in a computer, but really bloody hard to do in Modular. Hi, Fruit Bats. In this final example, I've got this hooked up to a computer, the most powerful of all algorithmic sequencers, of course. You can push this thing in arguably more bonkers ways than you can with control voltages, I would argue, because we can do the best of both worlds. We can do our prescriptive Zoxy programming, we can have our crazy like algorithmic things, and we can blend all those worlds. There's some fun things you can do with very basic tools in Ableton. Firstly though, isn't it wonderful to just be able to program this thing in a very specific way, get just the right feel and rhythm, and that's what you can do. By the way, if you send velocity amounts below 64, it will also change the sound. It says here they will result in shorter pulse lengths, which reduces the volume of the instrument in interesting ways. Dynamic playing via MIDI is possible. Plus you can send accents into it by playing in note 34. And as you may or may not be able to see, I've basically programmed some patterns on here. Oh, that's nice, isn't it? I've got a heavier pattern here. You can hear the accents being programmed. And by the way, I am driving this through LPZW's ProtoSat, which is a prototype saturator. I believe they're working on a new version that will be out at Superbooth. Now, here's where the fun begins, because we can send MIDI CCs using dummy clips here. I have a dummy clip, and if I go into the envelopes and I look for number 36, you can see that I've programmed the metal pitch, a metal tune, off. And here I've programmed the metal pitch and the metal spread, which are on these. That is MIDI CC 37 and 36. It's all written in the manual, but what is nice here is this ability to break the, or to decouple the modulation from the drums. It's something that is very modular, and you can do it in your computer. I can program MIDI CCs that change the metal tune, metal spread, also the noise tune here. The noise tune here is, the noise programming is this one, all high, all low. And so it makes the white noise bitty. And because we have such control in the computer, we can program sort of, long passages. I know this is obvious to you if you've ever used a computer, but it's so interesting to be able to do this. And through this dummy clip thing, we can also have a dummy clip which controls decay of the closed hi-hat. And this can run at a different rate to the programming of the metal pitch and to our break itself. It's just such control, and it's really interesting that we can MIDI control these parameters. I think that's pretty unique. What other what other drum machine can you do that on? And we record the results to our heart's content. But know that you can freak this thing with MIDI in very interesting ways. But I want to go a step further, which is I've started playing around with some of the really basic but interesting MIDI tools in here. And I want to play with note echo. Note echo is the ability to have a note be echoed via MIDI. So if you play in little simple patterns like this, you see my little but we turn on note echo. What it is going to do is create an echoed MIDI note, and it's going to shift it up a semitone. It's really fun. MIDI echoes of this pattern that are 6 beats behind the first ones that I played and are shifted up a semitone. Bonkers. And I've got some other variants. And by the way, while I am playing this, I am still playing my decoupled Just to remind you, this is all coming out of this one tiny little cable. And it's just MIDI in, crazy Ortega out. So fun. Yes, I like that. I think that's really fun. Things that you prescribe and things that are conditions that you set up and run away with you. There is a happy medium to be had in between the two. And finally, I want to play with something that I saw in this amazing video made by this channel, ASD. And this was recommended to me by people at Ableton. Such a fun video. I strongly recommend watching this whole thing. It's like a sort of like a higher being has created a tutorial about making drum patterns. And the principle that ASD expound is this idea that if you take the arpeggiator and you put it on a free running rate, then what happens is you create the ability to have drilling notes that slow down and speed up. And if you automate the rate, then you will create this kind of push-pull Gantt graph sort of thing. And so let's play some of this kind of really freaked arpeggiated patterns. And so you can see here, this is the automation of the rate of the arpeggiator, but we have a quite traditional rhythm running in the background with short notes. So there's separation between the notes. With high rate settings, you can create tones. It re-triggers fast enough that that's possible. Oof. But then the real insanity starts to occur when you... we have long notes. Here it turns into a sort of motorcycle. And then what we do is we automate. And if I was doing this in a really busy way, I'd probably do this on a per note basis. I'd create separate lanes for each of the notes and automate their curves so that each note Of course, we can still activate our dummy clips. Oh, yes, my friend, yes. Many ways to freak a drum machine, aren't there? Push things around. Software can push hardware super hard. We're embracing the predictable, that is patterns that we make ourselves by hand and so are therefore very satisfying. And we can then embrace the random and create conditions that are interesting. But I think for me, the happiest place is somewhere in the middle that repeat and loop so that they are satisfying and you can get into them. They're not so different every time round. You can do it with your computer and any kind of device that gives you interesting things to modulate via CCs or CV. So thank you, Tubatech and LPZW, and allowing me to hijack a demo of a drum machine to also just explore ways that I think are really interesting to push them around. I have a Patreon. I'll link below. There will be more freakiness very soon. Thanks very much. Bye.